We are living in one of the most dangerous moments in human history. As a former British soldier who served in NATO's wars, I've never been more concerned for the future of humanity. We have nuclear-armed states squaring up to each other. We have Ukraine, backed by nuclear powers, facing a nuclear power, firing missiles into nuclear powers territory. The Ukraine war could take us all down with it. At the same time happening, you have Israel, led by Netanyahu, desperate to hold on to power, itself a nuclear-armed state, backed by nuclear-armed states, looking at Iran as a way to extend his own hold on power. Things are really, really dire at the moment. And we have to be very clear now that criticising this march to war is not treacherous or traitorous, and it shouldn't be seen in that way. It's really about survival, potentially human survival. It's very clear to me, having been in the military, that the vast majority of people who fight and die and are injured and traumatised in the wars are not the children of the people who advance the narrow foreign policy goals. They're not the ruling class's kids, they're not Tony Blair's kids. They are overwhelmingly the children of the poor, working class, maybe the lower middle class, who go and fight and suffer in these wars. And that's just the people we're sending. It will also be the case that the people who are affected, the civilians who are caught up in the wars at the other end, and that should be intolerable to us. I think one of the problems is that the political class feel they can get away with it. Joe Biden, Keir Starmer, David Lammy, Macron, the Western leaders as an entity, none of you would fight on the front line, and you certainly wouldn't expect your kids to. So don't expect us to either. It seems mad the way they back genocide in Gaza with the full spectrum of military equipment on a civilian population, while carrying on in the completely opposite way in terms of their rhetoric and their actions with Russia and Ukraine. It's such a powerful thing to see that hypocrisy operating at the same time. It's not that long ago that Keir Starmer commented very powerfully on the ICC's issuing of arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin. Over a year later, the ICC came out with arrest warrants for Gallant and Netanyahu, and Starmer is yet to even comment on it. This is just the latest example of how the facade of international law, this idea of a global rules-based order, is coming apart as the West's own institutions like the ICC, which is one of the highest courts created by the West, and it seems like the West isn't even willing to enforce its own laws. This is a sign of decay in Western institutions, and it could be seen as a precursor to global war. Biden is very busy sending arms to Ukraine. He's trying to make sure that it won't be easy for Donald Trump to come into power, take office in January and just turn off the tap. There have to be questions about Biden's fitness. We've certainly seen in recent years evidence to suggest there are limitations on his abilities, and this is a man who is making decisions which quite literally decide the future of the world. But I don't think the real power lays with him. Obviously there are corporate interests, there are insiders in Washington who are a kind of permanent government, if you like, and there are arms firms, big corporations who are actually making these decisions which shape imperial politics in Washington and by extension shape the politics of allies around the world, including us in Britain here. Starmer's been quite tight-lipped on the use of a relatively small amount of missiles at 2 million a pop in case of the storm, Shadow missiles. What the rationale is for sending them to be used, because there are so few and it doesn't seem like they can really make a major tactical change or a strategic change to the war in Ukraine. And we also have to consider Putin's use of hypersonic ballistic missiles as part of a retaliation. He's sending a message. He's using missiles which could have a nuclear payload on them. And there's this sense of escalation back and forth between Ukraine, by which we also mean by extension the West, and Russia. And I think by doing that, he's sending a message. He's saying there could be mushroom clouds over Kiev. And I think it just adds to the sense of tension and danger which we have at the moment. Putin's just rewritten Russian nuclear doctrine so that he would be able to retaliate, not just if they're attacked by a nuclear state, but if they're attacked by a state whose weapons were supplied by a nuclear state. So this is a very, very precarious situation. It seems like there's a real ramping up. There's a sense of something quite awful, of something kind of uncoiling, of this threat of war uncoiling in a way that we haven't seen for many, many years. So we've recently seen NATO chief Mark Rutte talking about the need to change the trajectory of the war in Ukraine. And we can kind of, in a sense, we can get behind that. I mean, it's not a bad idea. We need to change it away from a nuclear war, obviously. But there is a question, I think, about how well NATO is positioned to do that. We have an organisation which is a Cold War relic. It's there to advance Western American imperial power. There has to be a question about how well positioned NATO is to alter the trajectory of this war in a positive sense. It could certainly help alter it in a really negative sense, where we can see a broader conflict spilling into other countries, and we have to remember always that there are nuclear powers involved. You can imagine a scenario, the scenario was reversed, that if Russia was pushing up bases, positioning missiles in Canada and in Mexico, the countries around the US or its colonies. You can imagine what the response would be to that. I mean, it'd probably be all-out war, it'd be all-out aggression. We're not pro-Russia when we say that, but it would be good if Western countries, Britain and the US, would just think about operating at a consistent standard, because the hypocrisy and double standard is really, really apparent. Foreign policy consensus is maintained, farmed, guarded by a tiny group of people, many of them whom have vested interests, and it is completely opposite to the general consensus in the polls around the world, West and elsewhere, in terms of support for the wars in Gaza and the wars in Ukraine. And what it speaks to is just a complete disengage between the ruling class and the rest of the world, between the people who make and enforce this foreign policy consensus, which is completely discredited. It's the consensus which gave us Iraq and Afghanistan, and no one's apologising for those anymore. US defence spending in 2023 was nudging $1 trillion, and the US defence budget is 40% of global defence spending, of which billions and billions of billions under the aegis, under the guise of it going to allies like Ukraine, actually just goes straight into the pockets of global arms firms. You can imagine just taking a fraction of that, put it into dealing with just the basic problems of America, a country with no healthcare like we enjoy, just a fraction of that into the opiate crisis, into poverty. You can imagine the difference it would make. But because of this consensus, which is austerity at home and aggression and violence overseas, that money which could be used to help people is just thrown into the gutter of war and militarism. According to Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, they have decided that we have to suffer, advancing what are clearly Tory policies. We have to suffer, but at the same time, there are vast billions of pounds which can just be frittered away, supporting Israel in its genocide, pouring arms and munitions into Ukraine in a war that might devastate the world, let alone the region. And it just seems to me that it cannot stand, and we have to think about how we're going to change that and stop looking to Parliament, get up off our knees and think about how we can do it, how working class people can do it, how normal people can develop a foreign policy and a domestic policy and proper provisions for welfare and housing and all these really important things, the real stuff, because it's always the case, you have to do it yourself in the end. Not all of us will remember, but in the 80s there was a fascinating artistic intervention in the form of a film called Threads, set in Sheffield of all places, which was about the true face of nuclear war and what happens afterwards. I advise everyone to go and watch it. It's a really kind of totemic, really powerful. Culture is really important. We need to revitalise that. Humans are capable of incredible things, of making incredible art, making incredible culture, of empathy, and of working together. And the tragedy is, particularly against the background of wars threatening, is that a small elite of people in pursuit of their own enrichment have forced all these wonderful and amazing and empathetic people with all their creative potential into a system which drives us increasingly towards war. And that is a terrifying thing. And I think there's a choice here about which way we go next, particularly under the threat of nuclear Armageddon, and how we think about our tactics and our strategies for getting there, getting to that better place. As someone who believes in change from below and studies history from below, I think we need to talk about a proper working class foreign policy and where that comes from, a proper foreign policy from below. And we need to talk about that in terms of the anti-war movement as it is now and how we start to tie that together. I think we need to re-energise the peace movement, re-energise CND, re-energise Stop the War. But then we also look at the targeted direct action stuff with Israeli arms manufacturers in the UK, for example. Great stuff, insurgent stuff. There's people out there putting their freedom on the line and losing it in some cases. Then we have to look at what's missing in this. And I think it's organised workers, unionised workers. There are some really good signs. There's been some really good stuff in the last year from the United Auto Workers in the US, many of whom are veterans who've seen the other end of war as well, who are talking about how we can stop arms being deployed, about the role of working class power in that, particularly in terms of workers in airports, dockers, workers who control vital choke points in the economy, and how we combine those with the protest movement, with the more direct action-based slowing down the arms trade, shipments of weapons. We need that kind of unity across those three different tactics and how you make them synergise. But I think what's missing is organised labour doing stuff. There is a long history of direct action, workers stopping arms shipments, dockers, for example, stopping arms shipments going in and out. And if the working class decides, and this is a question about how we formulate our own power, how we think about ourselves and what we can do, stop waiting for politicians to do it. Because if the working class decides, nothing moves, economies close down. That has to be the way forward, because the working class needs to flex its muscle when it comes to wars, because it will be your kids, if you're a worker, and you who will be sent to die in them. In times like these, it becomes very clear that voices for peace and reason have very little space in the media. And so now it's more important than ever to support independent journalists like us at Double Down News, voices of peace and dissent. So if you can, please support Double Down News on Patreon.